Good morning all, I'm Bryony Wilson of Global Shares, a JP Morgan company, and it's my pleasure to be able to chair this interactive webinar today. I can only do so thanks to the generosity of the members and sponsors, and with thanks to the Esop Centre members and FS Club sponsors who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics and finance. Before we get underway, we have some housekeeping notes ahead of today's session. Recent issues of Newspad are available to download in the chat and via the event page. The webinar is also being recorded and the video and podcast will be available in around 48 hours time. In terms of today's agenda, we'll be hosting a panel discussion between my fabulous panel, and we'll also be holding a 10-minute question and answer session following today's panel discussion. Please make sure to use the GoToWebinar chat facility. In the meantime, please feel free to send any questions in. We really do encourage that audience engagement. I will then either feed those into the discussion throughout or we'll pick them up as part of the Q&A at the end. Without further ado, I'm delighted to be joined on today's Esop sofa by three SharePlan superstars: Jennifer Rudman of EQ, Elliot Alexander of Computershare and Gabbi Stopp of ShareGift. All familiar faces to you, I am sure. Today we're going to change the format slightly, and rather than looking over a number of items within the Newspad, we're going to focus on the Spring 2023 budget. This budget announced that the government will be launching a call for evidence on SIP and ShareSave, and with a view to improve and simplify these tax advantage plans. We're going to dive into a few ideas that the panel have, but as always, and as I mentioned earlier, we do ask for crowd participation. So please let us know throughout of any great ideas that you may have to improve all employee plans, no matter how weird or wonderful. We're keen to hear your thoughts. We're going to start with SIP initially and then move on to ShareSave. First up, let's go to Gabbi, ex-director of ProShare and now CEO of ShareGift, to see what ideas have come to Gabbi's door in the past. Some of those may have been looked into, some of those may still be progressing now with HMRC. Gabbi, I'll hand over to you.
Lovely, thanks ever so much, Bryony. It's great to be here, and I owe special thanks to Esop for inviting me to join this panel. Well, top of the list for a while has been eliminating the 5-year taxable period for SIP, reducing it to just 3 years and aligning it with the minimum holding period. I mean, precedent for this was set, I think, with the old profit sharing scheme more than 20 years ago. I'm really showing my age here. But this has been on ProShare's wish list for a while, though I'm not speaking for them today. And it's been top of a number of other people's SharePlan's wish lists as well for some time. And I think it would be wonderful to see if we as an industry could finally get this over the line with HM Treasury.
Thanks, Gabbi. I think, as you say, it's definitely a topic of conversation that's been on all of our radars for a number of years now and would most certainly be a great benefit. Jen, I know you're equally as passionate about this, especially considering the current economic climate and the positive change that this would have in terms of pumping money back into the economy too. Don't know whether you want to add anything on that note.
I think I'd agree with Gabbi. It's top of the list. We've been asking for this for absolutely donkey's years, well, almost since it was first introduced, and it was reviewed in, I think, 2013. At that time, the Exchequer decided not to reduce the period because it would cost the Exchequer too much money. So we really had to come up with some good reasons for it to be changed this time round. And I think the key thing that we would like to see is the approach that it's a kind of big bang effect. So all current SIPs, all current partnership, matching, free shares that are in that period between 3 and 5 years all suddenly become available to be withdrawn from the plan tax-free. So a big bang effect down to 3 years across the board. So that's what we would like to see, and yeah, definitely top of our lists.
I think it's fair to say it would be a bit of an administrative nightmare if we didn't follow a big bang approach with that, isn't it? Elliot, I know that you also have some thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, look, I think I agree. Right, it would be very beneficial for all the participants. I think as well when we look at the economy, pumping the cash into the economy, giving individuals that cash to be able to spend would help with the cost of living. It would help with the economy. So I think generally it's a positive. It would benefit not only the participants but also sort of the wider UK as well.
Thanks, Elliot. I think moving on to the next point, the topic would be looking at dividends, SIP dividends in particular, and looking at whether there's anything in particular we can do to make this more attractive to participants, especially considering the recent change in the dividend tax threshold from £2,000 to £1,000. There's a further 50% reduction to come in the 2024 tax year, with that threshold decreasing to 500. I think from my perspective, I can only imagine that that may cause administrative challenges for participants in particular, people who may not have previously had to complete a tax return. Jen, I know this is something that Equiniti have had a look at, and you've looked at some of the statistics around what impact that may have.
Yes, so again, the key thing here is that the reduction to the dividend allowance to £500 from next year means that quite a lot of employees will have to pay tax on their SIP shares if they're receiving cash dividends. So at the moment, a very, very small proportion of SIP participants earn over that amount on their SIP dividends, but with these reductions coming through, the statistics bear out that there will be quite a few employees who will then have to think about paying dividend tax. And as you said, not all of them are doing self-assessment, so it's providing more information to employees on how they can do that, either through self-assessment or contacting HMRC. So our key ask, though, is we would like SIP participants not to have to pay any kind of tax on their SIP dividends at all. So the SIP is a tax advantage plan. So if you receive cash dividends in an ISA, you don't have to pay dividend tax on those. So why not extend that ISA principle into SIPs as well, because they're both tax plans. Now, if that's a step too far, an alternative suggestion relates to the tax on dividend shares. So at the moment, you can avoid having to pay dividend tax if you reinvest your cash dividends into dividend shares, and then you have a kind of tax advantage from doing that. However, that kind of falls down a little bit for bad leavers, because dividends used to buy dividend shares are taxed in the dividend the shares are withdrawn from the plan. So if bad leavers with dividend shares haven't held those dividend shares for more than 3 years, then they then have to pay tax when the shares are withdrawn from the plan. And because you're having potentially up to 3 years worth of dividends being taxed in one tax year, you're not having 3 years worth of allowance. All of those dividends count to that 1 year's dividend allowance. So when it gets down to £500 again, there's going to be a proportion of bad leavers who will now be paying tax. And I think that's a little bit of a kind of discouraging feature, because if they're taking cash dividends and had an allowance each year, they would have been able to potentially not have to pay any dividend tax. But now you're putting 3 years worth of dividends into one tax year's allowance, then they're going to be exceeding the allowance for that one tax year and having to pay tax, which they potentially may not have had to do if they received cash. So as I said, it's a bit of a discouraging feature. So it would be good, if we could suggest that, if we can't remove dividend tax for all of the shares, then at least it should be removed for dividend shares coming out for bad leavers.
I think they're all really interesting points, Jen, especially the point around bad leavers, because the communication there will also be key, making sure that participants are aware of the fact that they may fall into that category, and actually there may be a requirement for a self-assessment to be done, which, as you say, maybe not many participants are currently doing at the moment. There's been a lot on our radar over the last few years: COVID support, now the cost of living crisis. Elliot, do you have any suggestions on how we can focus on supporting lower paid workers in particular, and whether there's anything that maybe we can do within the SIP to be able to support that?
Yeah, I know a lot of companies are looking at how they can support lower paid workers, especially with cost of living crisis, energy bills going up in the UK. We know that HMRC previously looked at the possibility of introducing a 1-year free share award within the SIP. Of course, that brings challenges with the current sort of parameters that the SIP has. Everyone needs to be treated on the same basis. And so I think it brings challenges to sort of pull that into the SIP plan. But I think there's definitely an opportunity for sort of a standalone sort of 1-year free share award, which would be tax approved, which could be something that's aimed at a certain threshold of employee to support sort of lower paid workers.
I think it sounds great, doesn't it? Playing devil's advocate and really opening the panel up for a bit of a debate here. Some could say, it's only supporting those lower paid workers, then maybe people that fall just outside of that bracket, potentially single parents, people that earn just over whatever the lower paid earner threshold may be, could potentially miss out. I think it would be interesting to have some consideration about what we could do to potentially bridge that divide. Gabbi, I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, if we could increase the maximum saving amount from £150, as then there is more tax relief for those who can afford to invest, plus a greater match opportunity potentially, depending on the plan design. But I'm not convinced that we should be focusing our effort on changes that would benefit high earners. It is the lower earners who desperately need more help, especially now. And SIP is already a complex scheme. I think simplifying it, getting rid of that 5-year taxable period, would help all participants enormously. So that's where I would put my focus.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with that, Gabbi. That feels like a fair way of doing things, and simplicity is key, as we know, especially with all employee plans. Moving on to another radical idea, and Jen, one that I know you're extremely passionate about, would be removing resignation being a bad leaver. So making resignation a good leaver. Do you want to share some of your thoughts on that?
Well, it's all around. We know nowadays that employees are very mobile and they do move between jobs, especially if they want to progress in their careers. So by removing the concept of having bad leavers, so everybody becomes a good leaver, means that you're going to encourage a lot more employees into the SIP and SAYE plans, because they don't think, well, I'm not going to benefit from this because I'm going to be leaving quite soon. So if they should be rewarded, or you're encouraging them to save, then why then penalise them if they then leave the company? So really, yeah, just to have a bit of a change around and get rid of bad leavers, and make everybody a good leaver when they leave. But I think there may be one exclusion potentially to that, to allow employees who've been dismissed to still be treated as bad leavers.
Yeah, I think the key would be making resignation a good leaver reason, wouldn't it? Especially considering the workforce at the moment, and we know that people are moving around. There's the war for talent, people changing jobs more frequently than they ever have done. I think that's something that we would definitely all support, and means that participants can still own part of the company that they once worked for if they want to as well. Gabbi, is this something that has been looked into previously from what you know?
Yes, absolutely. This is one on the wish list, and it has been discussed and debated at length. But I mean, resigning and moving on from an employer is not a sin, as you say. It's a fact of modern working life, and I completely agree with Jen on her wish list item here. I mean, heaven knows I've moved on enough in my career, right? And it was always to progress and access new opportunities, and sometimes to improve my pay. So bad leaver treatment wasn't enough to dissuade me then, and it certainly isn't working as a retention tool now as it was once intended to. I think it's progressive and appropriate to reward people for their tenure, even if it's shorter than you might prefer as an employer. I mean, there are other forces motivating people to move jobs.
I would totally agree. I think it would be interesting to look at this from a ShareSave angle as well as SIP. Elliot, what would be your thoughts in terms of making resignation a good leaver reason for ShareSave?
Look, I think I'm in agreement with both Gabbi and Jennifer across both plans, right? I think there's warrant in doing it for SIP, but also for ShareSave. Again, employees would only benefit from the value of the contributions or the savings that they've made whilst being employed at that company. It could be something that's sort of built into plan rules, in a similar way that, for example, a 3-year savings period is built into the plan rules, or 5-year savings period is, and plan rules can be sort of flexible enough that the company could stipulate whether or not they want to offer that. So, I think having it approved at a sort of a HMRC level to allow, at that level, to then allow companies the flexibility to include it, I think is a great idea. And as Gabbi said, if you look at the modern workforce, people are tending to move much more quicker, much more frequently, move roles for various reasons, and so rewarding them for the time they've spent with an employer to me makes sense.
I agree, and with ShareSave, participants would only benefit to the value of the contributions that they've made to date as well. So their awards would, of course, be prorated based on the number of contributions received to that point. We've got a really interesting question from the audience, which I'm going to ask now because it fits in with what we're discussing. So just taking a small step back to the removal of resignation being a bad lever for SIP. Would we consider having resignation being a good lever for free shares and matching shares as well as partnership, or would we have a different opinion on that? Jen, I'll go to you first.
From my point of view, to keep things simple, I think you would need to have resignation as a good lever across the board, and that might be a step too far within SIP to do that. To have it different for different elements would just make it more complex than it would need to be. So for that reason, I don't know whether or not SIP would change to that extent. SAYE, I think you could build the flexibility in. So there's an example at the moment, if you have a 5-year plan, when you get to the 3-year point, so they're 3 years after the date of grant, the company can then choose whether or not a resignation can be treated as a good lever at that point. So I think you could extrapolate that kind of principle and bring it back to, so the company can choose to do that in a 3-year scheme when the employees get to the 2-year point, for example, or 1 year after the date of grant. So you could bring a bit of flexibility into that because that's already there, so you're just extending it out. So if getting rid of resignation as a bad lever is too far, then I think there are other ways that you can adapt it slightly. So I think that's easier with an SAYE than with SIP.
Thank you, Jen. Gabbi, I don't know whether you have anything to add to that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's a stronger argument for it on a contributory scheme. To Elliot's point, what you put in, you can benefit from that. I do agree with Jen that it would be more complex to have, to keep resignation as a bad lever for SIP free shares. The thing is, it makes it more expensive if you do aim for simplicity. I think there's an interesting debate to be had on this one.
Yeah, I would agree. I think let's move on to the next point, which is something that Jen, you're extremely passionate about, and we've heard Equiniti talk about it before, would be the opportunity to have a look back feature on ShareSave. Could you give us a bit of an overview of what we mean by look back and how you would foresee that working, what benefits it may bring?
Yeah, so definitely a bit of a Marmite suggestion, so not the top of everybody's lists, but still worth considering, I think. So SAYE look back, so this is something that I've seen in international SAYE schemes in their rules, and I think it could be adapted to UK SAYE. So the way that it would work is you carry out your normal SAYE invitation and launch. You provide an option price discount if you want to, up to the 20%. then you grant a specific number of shares under option to the employee based on the amount that they want to save. Now, just prior to maturity, if the scheme is underwater, what we want to do is allow the company to reset the option price. So in effect, looking at the market price, about a month before the maturity, and then resetting the option price so that you can then be flexible and give, a 5%, 10%, up to 20% discount to the market price at that time. So that would mean that at maturity, participants would be able to buy the original number of shares that they had been granted under that option, but at the lower option price. And then any excess savings that they have would then be repaid to the individuals. So there'd be a massive motivation then for participants in SAYE to stay until the maturity, because they know that they will be making a gain. It might only be a small gain, but at least it will be a gain. But you've also got that big motivation that the share price could be increasing as well, and you can have some large gains like we are, this year because of the COVID option prices that were set that were quite low. So there's a big motivation then for employees to stay within the SAYE plan and get some kind of return for their savings at the end of the period. Now, for employers, because you've got fewer people pulling out of the schemes, you don't have to accelerate the IFRS 2 charge for all the people who have pulled out early. So you're going to get more employees staying to the end. So there is a benefit through IFRS 2 reporting. Then at least the employees and the employers are getting a benefit through that charge, because employees are actually exercising their option. But also the company then, if everybody's exercising, they get their corporation tax deduction as well. So that's kind of outline of how it could work and why I think it would benefit employees and employers.
Gabbi, do you have any thoughts to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very smart idea. Look-back features have been used for SIPs now for many years, so I don't see why SAYE couldn't be adapted as Jen suggests. I'm a big fan of look-back features across different types of plan, and I've seen it used by companies on their SIPs when they IPO and they want to give their staff a SIP free share award, and setting the award price over a 6-month period. It does help to cushion employees against share price volatility, which is quite common in newly floated companies. And that's really important if you want to get your share plan off to a positive start. You want it to land well with employees. And after all, they've just been through the disruption and the distraction of an IPO process after all. So you want that plan to have the motivating effect that you intended. And of course, look back is a standard feature in US employee stock purchase plans, Section 423 plans. So and they're a close cousin of the SIP in many ways. So I think it's an idea that should be looked into.
I think it would definitely bring a range of advantages, especially Jen, as you referred to, the IFRS 2 reporting would most definitely support from a corporate perspective. I think, playing devil's advocate, on the other hand, it could create challenges around employee engagement, communication. Does it potentially make ShareSafe harder to communicate? On that topic of increasing engagement, ShareSafe auto enrolment is something that's also been discussed previously. Gabbi, what are your thoughts on that?
I have a feeling I'm going to be unpopular with some people on what I'm about to say. I vividly remember many calls for this when auto enrolment for pensions came in. And I have to admit, auto enrolment for contributory share plans, even ShareSafe with all its protections, it just gives me the ick, I'm afraid. We all know that share prices can go down as well as up, and at least with a pension plan, you're saving over the long term. You can set your risk appetite and have some say over the profile of investments too, mostly. Times are really tough for so many people right now, and some people are having to prioritise paying this quarter's electricity bill over everything else. And auto enrolment is not a help for them. It's yet another deduction from a paycheck that goes far less further than it used to, even just a year ago. What I think would help is a return to economic growth. I mean, that's a bigger problem than we can solve on today's webinar. decent, secure employment opportunities, affordable childcare, grants for retraining as well, because we are all going to have to work longer. We should expect to have pivot points in our working lives where we need to train for fundamentally different types of work. That's what we need. Share plans, auto-enrolment, not so much. I've always thought it was someone's bright idea looking for a problem to solve. So not for me.
Jen, I know you have potentially differing views, and that's why it's great to have a varied panel so we can have a good debate. You've also got some really interesting thoughts about how you could potentially do ShareSave auto-enrolment without necessarily a cost to the participant. Do you want to add some thoughts and some context behind your stance on this?
Yeah, I suppose, no, just listening to Gabbi, I agree with all of that. So I think maybe the word auto-enrolment has got a different connotation to how I would explain it. It's more around, how can you make it work for a company? So we're not in any way saying that, like, when you're paying into pension, that the company has to provide something. What we're saying is that if a company already does SAYE or wants to do SAYE, we're saying that that company should have the choice to be able to put all of their employees into that plan. So don't force companies to do SAYE, but if they do it, then they would have this choice to put their employees into their savings scheme. So going back to Gabby's point, can everybody afford it? That is one of the main reasons that people don't join SAYE. So what we want to do is, with the company, they provide cash benefits to their employees. Would they be prepared to pay the first, say, £10 of the contribution for all employees? So they would automatically enrol everybody into the scheme and pay the first £10 of that monthly contribution. So what would mean is, over a year period, they'll be giving the employees £120 to put into their SAYE savings account. So you're giving an additional benefit to all of the employees. And the big thing on this is that you're then getting employees into SAYE. Now, if they want to contribute up to £500, they can add to that £10 that the company are contributing. But it's just getting the employees into it, getting them saving, and that's one of the key things, isn't it, at the moment, trying to get employees to save money, to make them more financially resilient in the future. So the company is giving some money to employees that they then have to put away in an SAYE account. Now, the employees may not want to do it, so they can opt out, or they may need to have that cash before you get to the end of the 3 years, in which case they can withdraw it, but then the company doesn't contribute any further. So that's our kind of idea. So whether that's auto-enrolment, as we know, or some way of being able to put employees into an SAYE plan and contributing, getting them into saving, getting them into share plans, that's the kind of idea that we would like to see. A massive increase then in the number of participants within the schemes, which would be brilliant.
Yeah, I would agree on that point. In terms of take-up, it would definitely be a benefit. There's a totally mixed divide between the audience comments that I'm seeing at the moment, with some people that are totally in agreement with Gabbi, some people are totally in agreement with the points that you've made, Jen, so a total split down the middle there. Elliot, I don't know whether you have anything to add on the auto-enrolment topic.
No, I think it's an interesting topic, right? And there's I think valid points for and valid points against. The undertone of all of this is helping individuals, right? Helping them save, helping them have build a nest egg, and also have own a part of the company when the options are mature of the company that they're working and have a say. So I think it's an interesting topic. I'm sure one that will be debated for some time. But look, I certainly don't disagree with Gabbi or Jen. I'm doing that thing of sitting on the fence where. But look, I think providing that we're doing it with the right intentions, similarly as Gabbi mentioned, the pension scheme, where now everyone has a pension. That wasn't the case sort of in the past. I think there's benefits to it, but to be done in the right way.
Thank you all for your thoughts on that one. Last question from myself before we up to ideas and questions from the audience. On that note, please continue sending those questions in. I can see there's a number of those for us to go through. We're going to take a step back a little bit now and look at the eligibility criteria generally for all employee plans. We know that we're in a climate where gig workers are on the rise. Is there anything that we can do to potentially support the definition of an employee? Gabbi, what are your thoughts?
This is one of my hobby horses. So yeah, I mean, there are at least 1 million gig workers in the UK at the current time, and the thing is, seeking to define gig workers as employees always meets with a huge amount of resistance in certain quarters, because after all, companies engaging gig workers recognise that classing them as employees makes them much more expensive, and it blows a hole in their operating model. So there is resistance to that idea. But I think instead of looking at individuals, look at the plans and look at the associated legislation. It might perhaps be better to redefine share plan eligibility, or develop a gig worker specific share plan, which would mean looking at elements of the Companies Act around, who you can and can't give shares to. Inclusion in share plans would make a massive difference to gig workers. That much is very true. And it would also have advantages for companies engaging gig workers. You have greater workforce cohesion, improved productivity as well, which is a key concern. And some of this is a bit intangible, perhaps, or hard to measure, but we know that this would have a positive impact. And it would also ensure that share plans remain relevant in what is a rapidly changing workplace. That, for me, is the really important thing to ponder there.
I think there's a couple of really interesting points there, isn't there? Whether it's redefining share plan eligibility or a gig worker plan in itself, I think both create different opportunities, and ultimately getting capital into the hands of people whose work have helped create the value is, incredibly important, arguably even more so in the current economic environment and unequal society. It definitely deepens the purpose of broader share ownership. Shouldn't just be a minority sport, I think, is what I've heard you say previously, Gabbi. For those that are super senior in their organisations, those that have potentially inherited wealth or are old enough to have participated in demutualisations. It's definitely a real big advantage there around increasing employee share ownership, and the time to be radical is now. Otherwise the ship could sail, should I say, and without us, broad-based employee share plans will become obsolete. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of food for thought there. Let's move on to audience engagement, starting with some of the thoughts and questions that have come into the chat box. One that has come through is, how can issuers get involved with supporting the call for evidence? Do we think the best approach will be individual submissions, or in fact a more holistic industry approach? Gabbi, Jen, happy for either of you, or Elliot, does anybody have any immediate thoughts on that? How can we make a real big impact in this call for evidence?
That's the key question at the moment, because if we want to get some of the key things through, like the SIP tax period reduced from 5 to 3 years, how's best? Is it best every single company puts in a response to the Treasury call for evidence, or do we all get together as an industry, which I think probably is going to be a little bit more difficult? So I think we'll end up with the industry bodies putting in their thoughts, but needing to show that there is support amongst companies and issuers as well. We'll certainly be putting in our thoughts about what should go in there, and they might be slightly different to other administrators or other industry bodies, their thoughts, but at least we get an opportunity then to set out what we think. But we just need to do a little bit more engagement with all issuers going forward, because we've got all these ideas, but unless they're supported by the issuers, it's pointless doing that. So it's somehow getting the issuers involved in this process and getting some real good discussions going about exactly what they want. We've got ideas, but there's loads more out there, and it's going to be a period of discussion, I think, for the next 6 months.
Yeah. Gabbi, anything to add to Jen's point there.
Yeah, there are probably two different approaches, aren't there? There's, one way where we speak with one voice as an industry, which is really hard to coordinate, but we'll prioritise the things that most of us agree on, like the SIP 5-year period, maybe a couple of other bits as well. Or there's the approach where everybody puts their 2 penneth in, and the Treasury have to, recognise that lots of people have lots of really good ideas, but that everyone agrees that this is well overdue and that share plans do need a really good shake-up in order to stay relevant. 2 different approaches. I'm not sure which one I favour, but I'm very happy to to help be a sounding board for anyone who wants to pass some ideas, and have a bit of a debate.
Yeah.
And also, looking for the key things that will hook the government into thinking that change would be good as well. So again, it's around productivity, it's around levelling up, engendering, just making sure that there's a kind of savings culture out there. It's looking at some of those key things and making the changes. How would that then help the government achieve what they're trying to achieve?
Definitely aligning to their objectives is a smart way to advance our arguments. So yeah, I endorse that.
Yeah, I think it's just important that everyone has their say. The way I agree, the way in which we present that as an industry, I don't think is yet defined, but I think it's important that everyone inputs, so it's across everyone in the industry. Yeah, because ultimately the more that we have as an industry, the more change is going to come.
Thank you. Another question from the audience, going back to SIP now, would be, can there please be lobbying to remove the lower salary limit? Employees are intelligent enough to know what they can afford to contribute, and this can often place an unnecessary burden on a company to assess different limits for lower paid employees. Do we have any thoughts on that question? See some smirks. Gabbi, any thoughts? Have you done that before?
Yeah, this is taking me back to my in-house days. It's given me a little bit of a flashback, I have to admit. It is a really fiddly part of the plan, and yeah, I'd be happy to see it go. I agree with the person asking the question. Employees do understand how much they can contribute, and there isn't the need for that lower limit.
Anything from yourself, Jen, on that point?
So you're saying do away with the minimum savings amount, or is that what you're asking? Whether or not we should do away with the minimum savings amount? Is that the question? Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty low at the moment, isn't it? £5–10. Yeah,
that's it.
So what? Reducing it down to £1 or £2? I think then, if you're saying reduce it from £10, then yeah, I don't have too strong opinion. If it reduces to 5, but if it's lower than 5, I think the administration involved in that for the amount that they're saving isn't that great, I wouldn't have thought. So it's not absolutely something to be looked at to see what the minimum level should be, but I don't think I've got strong thoughts on that at the moment.
Yeah, I guess there's the other angle in terms of the maximum savings amount into the SIP, isn't there, where the limit is £150 a month or 10% of your annual salary for those that are maybe part-time workers, lower paid workers. Could they in fact contribute potentially more than 10% of their monthly salary into the SIP? But yeah, definitely.
They're not the primary wage earner, yeah.
Yeah. Let me have a look at some of the other questions that have come through. One of the questions would be, what are our thoughts on introducing a shorter term share save plan, such as a 1 or 2 year plan, to encourage those employees who may not hang around with an employer for 3 or 5 years? I know this is something that has been debated in the past. There's been the talk of a 1 year share save previously. I think that may have been squashed potentially, but let's reignite that conversation. Elliot, any thoughts on a shorter term?
I suppose it feeds into the discussion we had on resignation being a good leaver treatment, because in effect, if an employee is staying with the company and been saving for a year and then they leave on good leaver terms, then in a sense, albeit it's a 3-year scheme, they would have only contributed for a year. So I think it sort of ties into that in some ways. I certainly don't want to oversimplify it, but I think they sort of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And I'd agree with Elliot on that. The push, I think, should be to make resignation a good lever, so that they're going in, so they're not, so that, you know, if they do leave, then they can benefit from the plan as well. So rather than reduce the period too far, then to make, you know, enable employees to benefit at an earlier stage if they leave.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, Elliot. I think we've got some really strong views from the audience around the 5-year tax-free period reduction to 3 years. So one of the comments is that's pretty much everyone in the industry would consider that this is the single most important thing. Maybe wrong, it's caveated with. If that's the case, it's definitely worth industry bodies coordinating, at least on this point, so that we put this down as #1 priority. It's probably a great opportunity for me to ask you guys, if you had a magic wand and you could grant one of these wishes, what would that wish be? Elliot, I'll start with you. If you could change one thing to simplify and improve either SIP or ShareSave, what would be your go-to?
It would be the reduction of the tax-free from 5 to 3 years.
Jen?
Oh, absolutely, that point. 20 years of asking, 23 years of asking. We're just hoping this time around we get strong enough arguments to get it changed.
Gabbi?
Well, I'm certainly not going to argue with that, although you know, if I had to have a favourite plan that I would really love to see sort of reinvigorated, it would be ShareSave. But that getting rid of the 5-year taxable period on SIP it has to be #1 on the list.
I think we're somewhat unified on that response, aren't we? I think with that in mind, it definitely poses the question around how we can bring together those responses as part of the call for evidence, maybe in one unified approach. I think on that note, there are a couple more questions from the audience in the chat. I don't think any of them we're going to be able to answer in the short amount of time we've got left, so we can take those away and we can revert back to people afterwards with our responses. I think above all, it's really clear from today's panel that there's a lot of food for thought regarding how we can look to improve and simplify both SIP and ShareSave. We appreciate that some of the ideas we've discussed today are not new. However, government personnel has changed so much over the recent years that we do feel positively optimistic that they may be more open to some of these suggestions, and further information will no doubt follow on how this evidence is to be submitted and how we can potentially coordinate as an industry. Please feel free to continue dropping any of your thoughts into the chat box whilst I wrap up today's session. I would like to thank the sponsors, the audience for your questions and engagement, and last but by no means least, my fabulous panel, Gabbi, Elliot, Jen, thank you for joining us today and for delivering such an interesting conversation and panel discussion for us. There are resources available to the audience alongside a host of upcoming events available within the Esop Centre FS Club website, which you can see on screen now. And I'd just like to finish by thanking you all for joining. We hope that you found the panel session today useful, and we hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks.